They delayed flight for black woman extra screening. She made the airline CEO testify in Congress. A single suitcase trailed behind Vanessa Carter as she hurried through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a place bustling with energy and possibility yet weighed down by the silent tensions of who was treated fairly and who was not. Little did she know this hectic day would spark a historic showdown that would capture the nation's attention, force a billionaire airline CEO to testify on Capitol Hill, and question the very fabric of civil rights in modern travel. This was no ordinary trip for Vanessa. This was the moment that would transform her from an ordinary passenger into a symbol of courage, justice, and unstoppable resolve. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport thrived with the usual morning clamor, families reuniting, business people in pressed suits checking departure boards, tourists hoisting bulging backpacks. It was a microcosm of the country's promise. People of diverse backgrounds and dreams converging in one place, each waiting to be propelled across the skies to new destinations. Against that backdrop, Vanessa Carter's eyes sparkled with anticipation. She was a young African-American attorney, an Atlanta native proud of her roots. She had just finished a formidable week, working pro bono cases for an underserved community organization. Now, she was heading to Washington, D.C., for a well-deserved short break, partly leisure, partly a chance to speak informally to a few policy advocates on important civil rights matters. Vanessa believed in optimism and in the subtle power of kindness. Even as she navigated the hustle of the airport, juggling her smartphone, passport, and boarding pass, she flashed warm smiles at gate agents and made small talk with a TSA officer about the unpredictable Georgia weather. It was a glimmer of her personality, always open, always eager to connect. Because, in her mind, progress is built one conversation at a time, one genuine moment of empathy, forging intangible but potent bonds. Everything about that morning felt routine. The plan was simple: board the Delta Airlines flight at 9:15 a.m. to Washington National Airport, check into a modest hotel near Capitol Hill, spend a day or two attending an educational seminar on emerging civil rights issues. Maybe even indulge in some sightseeing, including a long overdue visit to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But when she arrived at the security checkpoint, her perfectly organized itinerary began to show the first signs of unraveling. The screening area was packed tighter than usual, with tourists fumbling with their shoes and laptops, business travelers impatiently tapping their feet, and TSA officers doing their best to manage the bottleneck. Vanessa patiently stood in line, edging forward every few minutes. When it was her turn, she stepped through the scanner, placed her arms up as instructed, and expected a routine wave through. Suddenly she was asked to step aside. A stone-faced TSA supervisor, eyes cool and mechanical, asked if she would consent to a more thorough screening. Vanessa blinked, the request taking a moment to register. She had done nothing suspicious, was dressed conservatively in a navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, and wasn't traveling with unusual electronics. Puzzled, she politely asked why she was being singled out. The supervisor avoided eye contact and robotically repeated the same line, "We need you to come with us, ma'am." Her heart began a slow, uneasy thump. Vanessa fought to maintain composure as she followed the official to a stark, windowless screening area off to the side. She hadn't anticipated this at all. She tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just random protocol. But as the minutes turned to nearly half an hour, and she overheard hushed voices of other TSA officers flitting around her, something felt off. The questions had a strange flavor, many of them about her personal background, her work as an attorney, and why she was traveling alone. It sounded suspiciously personal. Her internal alarms went off. When they finally released her, less than 10 minutes remained before her flight was set to close boarding. Vanessa tried to gather her belongings as quickly as possible and dashed out of the special screening room. She half jogged, half sprinted toward gate 29, only to see the door shut and the plane pushing back from the jet bridge. Out of breath and frustrated, she couldn't believe she had been detained long enough to miss her flight. She sank into a nearby seat, her pulse racing. A uniformed gate agent hovered at the counter, making announcements for other departing flights. With a mixture of anger and desperation, Vanessa approached him, explaining what had happened and how she had been pulled aside. The agent gave her an apologetic shrug, typed furiously into the computer, and printed out a standby ticket for the next flight to Washington, D.C. That flight wouldn't depart for another 4 hours. Already, her meticulously planned schedule was in shambles. Vanessa slumped into a plastic airport chair, replaying the humiliating experience over and over in her mind. Something about it didn't feel right. A creeping suspicion nudged at her. She had been racially profiled. Under the guise of random selection, her flight had been delayed, at least for her, by something that felt suspiciously discriminatory. But was it truly that, or was she overthinking? She decided to keep calm and note every detail, as she had learned in law school. The name of the TSA supervisor, the time of the screening, the nature of the questions. She jotted everything down in the Notes app on her phone. A wave of frustration brewed inside her. But for now, all she could do was wait for the next flight. She stared at the standby ticket in her hands with a sense of disbelief. If this was just the beginning, she had no idea how large a storm was brewing on her horizon. It was 2 hours into her delay when Vanessa finally decided to break the news to her friend, Veronica, a Senate staffer who had invited her to meet with a group of civil rights advocates at a private lunch in D. CTHTYD been excited to catch up and talk shop about ongoing legislative efforts. Vanessa hated the idea of sounding flustered or weak, but what choice did she have? She was now stuck waiting, uncertain if she would even land in time to attend the meeting. "Hey, V," she said softly into her phone after stepping into a quieter corner near a duty-free shop. "Something happened at the airport. I got pulled aside for extra screening. They wouldn't let me go until I missed my flight." Veronica's voice was a mixture of immediate concern and outrage. Why would they single you out, do you think? She didn't even need to finish the question. The possibility of racial bias hung in the air like an ugly shadow. "I don't want to make hasty accusations," Vanessa replied, though a tinge of bitterness sharpened her voice. "But the questions they asked, it just didn't feel random at all." Veronica sighed audibly on the other end. "You okay? Do you need me to help with anything? Contact someone." "No, not right now. I'm on standby for a later flight, but this is just so humiliating. And I know they've probably done this to so many people who never speak up." Her friend's voice took on a more purposeful tone. "Girl, you're a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, but a civil rights lawyer. If they pick the wrong one to mess with, you'll make sure they regret it, right?" Vanessa gave a weak laugh, a semblance of relief that someone believed her. They ended the call with mutual reassurances. The phone slipped back into Vanessa's purse as she tried to quell the emotional whirlpool in her mind. She typed out an email to the community advocacy group she worked with, describing the situation in a factual, bullet-point format, as though building a case. She still wasn't entirely sure she was prepared for a fight, but the anger inside her was growing into resolve. Minutes turned into hours. She eventually boarded the next flight to Washington, D.C., the entire time dealing with a swirl of indignation and an unshakable sense of disbelief. When the plane touched down late in the afternoon, the day's sun was already waning. Her missed opportunity weighed heavily on her, but something else began to dawn. If she was feeling this outraged, how must others feel who lacked her legal training, her connections, or even the financial resources to rebook flights? A simmering determination took hold of her. She thought back to the pain in her mother's voice whenever discussing the old Jim Crow era, or the stories her grandmother told about indignities faced at airports and bus stations in the 1950s and 1960s. The echoes of the past felt hauntingly present. Still wearing the same navy blazer, crumpled from hours of stress, Vanessa hailed a cab and headed to her hotel. She sank onto the bed, her mind churning with questions. Was this experience a fluke, an anomaly, or was this part of a larger pattern that the public rarely hears about? From that exhaustion, a single, crystal-clear thought emerged. She had to do something, maybe writing a formal complaint or even filing a lawsuit against the airline or the TSA was the next step. She wasn't sure yet, but she knew she couldn't just let it go. Because sometimes, when the path to justice calls, you have to answer, even if it comes at the cost of peace and normalcy. She changed into more comfortable clothes, let the waves of anger, sorrow, and disbelief pass over her, and set out to salvage whatever remained of her day in D.C. The evening was cool, the city lights reflecting on the Potomac. But behind all that beauty lay a system that had just marginalized her in the most public way possible. Vanessa Carter was no stranger to advocating for others, but never had she felt so personally attacked. She resolved then and there to consult with a few close colleagues, gather evidence, and decide on the next move. And she had no idea just how colossal that next move would be, or that it would eventually involve a seat in one of the most powerful hearing rooms in the United States. The following morning, Vanessa woke up to the faint hum of traffic outside her hotel window. The frustration of missing the critical lunch meeting the previous day still stung, but she tried to keep her focus on how to move forward. She spent the early hours checking email, responding to sympathetic messages from colleagues who'd heard about her ordeal, and sipping a cup of green tea that did little to soothe her raw nerves. At mid-morning, she headed to a small cafe near Capitol Hill to meet with two civil rights attorneys she admired, Victoria Pierce and James Marshall. Both had extensive experience in discrimination cases against large organizations. As the trio greeted each other, the sense of camaraderie was immediate. They settled into a quiet corner, away from the chatter of lobbyists and staffers discussing deals in hushed tones. Victoria, a tall woman with an assertive presence and eyes that never missed a detail, started with a simple question. "How are you holding up, Vanessa?" Vanessa offered a fleeting smile. "I'm frustrated, humiliated, and a bit furious, to be honest. But I'm also determined I can't let this slide." James nodded, his steady gaze assessing her. "We've each handled cases involving airport security issues, often small claims that never see the light of day in mainstream media. But if you're serious about challenging the TSA or the airline, be prepared for a tough fight. They have an army of lawyers." Victoria gently placed a hand on Vanessa's shoulder. "But here's the thing, you have the legal background, the personal experience, and you're a credible plaintiff. This could be more than just your complaint. It could shine a spotlight on a pattern of discriminatory practices. These random screenings aren't always so random." Vanessa exhaled, letting the tension from her shoulders relax a bit. "That's what I'm thinking. If I don't speak up, who will?" She recounted every detail of her experience, from the odd personal questions to the missed flight. Her voice trembled with equal parts anger and vulnerability. She admitted she didn't feel entirely safe in the moment, like she was being cast as a threat simply because of her skin color. James exchanged a knowing glance with Victoria. "We'll stand by you, Vanessa. We can craft a strong legal strategy, possibly even a class action if we find more people with similar stories. The question is whether you're ready for the media and the potential backlash. Because once we go down this road, it's going to be a major case that could take years." Vanessa felt a swirl of apprehension. She flashed back to the humiliating isolation in that stark screening room. Then she recalled the legacy of her heroes, civil rights icons, who took monumental risks to ensure a fairer future for everyone. "I'm ready," she said quietly but firmly, sealing her resolve. By the time they left the cafe, a preliminary plan was already in motion. Victoria and James would do the initial digging for any similar complaints, while Vanessa would write a thorough statement describing her ordeal and how it related to broader issues of racial profiling. They would also contact the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights to see if there was an ongoing investigation or if they could open a new one. Later, when she stepped back out onto the busy DCSTRET, Vanessa felt a sense of purpose that was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. She had come to Washington expecting a short getaway and a few professional chats. Instead, she was on the cusp of igniting a legal battle that could shake one of the nation's largest airline carriers and its partnership with the TSA. She didn't know it yet, but her fight wouldn't remain hers alone. A chorus of voices, some supportive, some hostile, would soon join the fray. For now, though, the calm hush before the storm lingered in the crisp autumn air. Vanessa inhaled deeply, already feeling how each step toward justice was both a personal risk and a collective necessity. Something told her this was no mere coincidence. Fate had placed her here, tested her convictions, and readied her for a battle that would resonate far beyond the airport gates. 2 days after her meeting with Victoria and James, Vanessa carefully finalized her formal complaint. She attached it to a succinct cover letter and sent both documents to the Customer Relations Department at Delta Airlines, the TSA's Civil Rights Division, and the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights. In it, she meticulously recounted the events, including times, dates, names, and how the entire ordeal violated not only her constitutional rights but also several federal regulations. A quiet sense of both dread and relief washed over her as she clicked send. She knew bureaucracy could be slow, but she hoped that her standing as an attorney, combined with the thoroughness of her documentation, would at least get someone's attention. Then, without warning, an unexpected ally emerged: social media. After attending a small gathering of community organizers in Southeast DC, she recapped her airport experience in a heartfelt Facebook post. She had fewer than 600 friends on the platform, so she didn't expect the post to go far. However, the story struck a nerve. Friends shared it, who then shared it again. Within 48 hours, the post had racked up thousands of reactions, and a public figure who advocated for racial justice tweeted a link to Vanessa's story, praising her courage. Emails poured in, many from people who claimed similar treatment at airports across the country. Some described humiliating pat-downs, missed flights, or traumatic encounters with TSA officials. Many were African American travelers, though some were from other marginalized groups. It became clear this was not an isolated incident. Vanessa found herself staying up until the early morning hours, reading these accounts, feeling her heart ache for the families and individuals who had felt helpless in the face of what they believed was blatant discrimination. Local news outlets took notice. Within a week, 2 small TV stations in Atlanta picked up the story. They interviewed Vanessa on Zoom, asking for details about her experience and how she felt about the wave of support. Her composure and articulate honesty struck a chord with viewers. By the time the interviews aired, the rumor mills were churning with speculation that Vanessa might file a high-profile lawsuit. Reporters also sought comment from Delta's public relations team, who offered a generic statement: "We are investigating the incident and strive to maintain a fair and respectful travel environment for all passengers." The airline's lukewarm response only fueled public outrage. Civil rights groups in Atlanta and DC declared they would rally behind Vanessa if she chose to pursue litigation. Some even started to assemble personal stories from their own members, building a grassroots movement aimed at exposing systematic discrimination in airline travel. Vanessa watched her life change in real time. She was inundated with emails, phone calls, even direct messages on Instagram from strangers who viewed her as a beacon of hope. It was overwhelming, but also galvanizing. Her desire to seek justice grew stronger with each testimony she read. Delta's internal leadership, for their part, seemed unprepared for the sudden swell of negative attention. Rumblings from inside the airline suggested that senior vice presidents were scrambling to figure out how to contain the crisis. Officially, they claimed to be in the process of reviewing procedures, but nothing concrete emerged. Behind closed doors, their legal team recognized that if a class action lawsuit took shape, it could be a public relations disaster. Amid the buzz, Vanessa stayed focused on the legal case. Victoria and James, along with a small coalition of fellow civil rights lawyers, worked tirelessly to gather plaintiff statements and examine the relevant sections of federal law. The more they probed, the more it became evident that the TSA's security partnership with airlines left too much room for subjective judgment calls, which often ended up targeting people of color disproportionately. The public fervor escalated to the point where prominent civil rights organizations, such as the NAACP, reached out. They hinted that they would be interested in filing an amicus brief if this went to court. Advocacy groups for airline passengers began calling for legislative hearings to review screening practices. Clearly, the issue had grown bigger than one person's missed flight. Vanessa Carter was no longer just a name on a delayed passenger manifest. She was the face of a burgeoning movement. Part of her felt overwhelmed by the newfound spotlight. She'd always envisioned herself as a dedicated community lawyer, quietly championing the underserved. Yet, fate had thrust her onto a national stage. Through the swirling mix of fear, excitement, and uncertainty, she kept her eyes on the broader aim to confront an injustice that had simmered under the radar for far too long. What she didn't anticipate was how aggressively the airline would fight back, or that the repercussions would be felt at the highest levels of corporate and governmental power. Rumors that Ed Bastian, Delta's CEO, might be summoned to testify in front of Congress started as a mere whisper. But as the narrative gained momentum, that whisper would soon become a full-throated demand for accountability. Vanessa stepped out of a taxi onto the bustling sidewalk in front of her Atlanta law office, arms loaded with case files. She was startled to see 3 reporters waiting near the entrance. Microphones and cameras angled toward her with hungry anticipation. The sight froze her mid-step. It was the first time the media had turned up in person at her workplace. A local anchor rushed forward. "Miss Carter, any comment on the possibility of a class action lawsuit against Delta Airlines?" A second reporter's voice clashed with the first. "Vanessa, are you in talks with any members of Congress regarding discriminatory profiling by major airlines?" Her heart rate spiked. She glanced around for a quick exit, but the press box had her cornered near the glass doors. Summoning a professional tone, she straightened her posture. "I can't comment on any pending legal matters at this time, but I'm grateful that so many people are sharing their stories. That's all for now." She ducked through the doorway, ignoring further shouts. Once safely inside, she inhaled a shaking breath. This was getting serious, and fast. Her office building's lobby was all polished floors and austere walls, as if designed to impress from the moment you walked in. She stepped into the elevator, still rattled by the encounter. Upon reaching her firm's floor, she immediately felt the curious glances from co-workers. Whispers and half-hidden smiles confirmed that everyone was well aware of her media spotlight. Behind a mahogany desk, her assistant Alan looked up with concern. "Miss Carter, I got a call for you about 5 minutes ago." A representative from a major broadcasting network wants to schedule a television interview. She pressed her lips together, vaguely nodding as she accepted several message slips. Another day, another wave of inquiries. She pushed open the door to her modest corner office, the city skyline behind her acting as a silent witness to her turmoil. Before she could even settle in, her cell phone vibrated. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. She answered hesitantly, "Good morning, Miss Carter. This is Marla DeWitt from Dorsey & Lank, external counsel for Delta Airlines. We're reaching out to see if you're amenable to an off-the-record conversation regarding your complaint." Vanessa stiffened, her mind instantly racing. "I'm represented by counsel, Miss DeWitt. Any discussions should go through my attorneys," she replied firmly. Her experiences as a lawyer had taught her that an overture like this could be an attempt to glean information or find a quick settlement on hush-hush terms. "Of course," the woman responded, her tone too polished to be sincere. "We'll be in touch with them shortly then. Have a pleasant day." Vanessa hung up, her nerves thrumming. She promptly dialed Victoria and James, leaving urgent messages to let them know about the call. The airline was making moves. Whether that would lead to a settlement offer, intimidation tactics, or an attempt to discredit her, she couldn't say. She turned to her backlog of pro bono cases, trying to concentrate on the everyday responsibilities that anchored her life, but concentration was hard to come by. A swirl of thoughts kept pulling her back to that phone call. Why now? What was their angle? Just as she managed to lose herself in a battered women's shelter legal case, her phone rang again. This time, it was James returning her call. "Hey, I talked to Mr. Witt," he said gravely. "She hinted that Delta is willing to discuss a private settlement, but they're not admitting any wrongdoing. Also, they'd want you to withdraw your complaint. They're worried about the negative PR." Vanessa drummed her fingers on her desk, feeling a wave of indignation. A hush money approach? She inhaled deeply. "I'm not interested in hush money. I want systematic changes, policy reforms, accountability." James's voice held an approving tone. "We're on the same page. Don't worry, we'll keep the lines of communication open, but this is bigger than a quick payout." Also, rumor has it that certain lawmakers on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure are talking about holding a hearing on discriminatory practices in air travel. This is blowing up fast. Vanessa thanked him and hung up, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. So the airline was trying to do damage control, while members of Congress considered opening an inquiry. In an odd twist, her small voice had ignited a national conversation, with ramifications spiraling well beyond her personal experience. She spent the rest of the day juggling phone calls, fielding supportive texts, and trying to reassure her parents, who were both excited and worried. Her mother, in particular, insisted on caution, fearing that big corporations might try to smear her reputation or target her safety. Vanessa soothed her concerns, but in truth, the same anxieties gnawed at her. She just refused to let them dominate her sense of purpose. Late that evening, she left the office, the sky awash with deep orange and pink hues. The reporters were still stationed outside, leaning on railings, waiting for any sign of her. She turned her collar up, walked swiftly, and declined to comment as cameras trailed her to the street. For the first time in her life, Vanessa felt like a reluctant public figure, a chosen mouthpiece for hundreds, maybe thousands, of travelers who had been wronged. The bright lights of the news cameras might have cast her in an uneasy spotlight, but a deeper force kept her going, the belief that justice, once stirred, cannot be easily silenced. A week later, Vanessa found herself sitting at a sleek wooden table inside James Marshall's downtown office. A projector screen displayed a dizzying array of data dates, flight numbers, airport checkpoints from travelers nationwide who had contacted their legal team. Some patterns leaped out immediately. Certain routes, often used by predominantly Black or Hispanic communities, had higher incidence reports of extra screening. Late-night flights saw a disproportionate number of these incidents as well. Victoria tapped a pen against the table, the sharp staccato matching the tension in the room. This is more extensive than we thought. If we can show systematic bias, especially in partnership with the TSA, then we can build a compelling civil rights case. James rubbed his temples, scanning the spreadsheets on his laptop. We have enough for a multi-plaintiff lawsuit. The question is, do we attempt to keep it consolidated under your single name as the principal plaintiff, or do we file a broader class action right away? Vanessa, seated between them, weighed the options. I want the biggest impact, but also the strongest legal footing. Class actions can drag on for years, and the airline's lawyers will try to pick us apart. From across the table, Josephine Chan, a newer addition to the legal team, cleared her throat. There's another angle. The media is shining a spotlight on you, Miss Carter. If you lead the suit, it'll attract attention. But if we secure a bigger group, it shows this is widespread, not just one person's complaint. They debated strategy for over an hour, eventually deciding to move forward with an initial multi-plaintiff complaint that showcased about a dozen well-documented cases, including Vanessa's. Their stories ranged from a schoolteacher who missed her mother's funeral due to a so-called random screening, to an elderly gentleman harassed to the point of tears because he walked with a cane and was told it needed extra scrutiny. Before breaking up, they discussed potential next steps. Victoria brought up the possibility of reaching out to a local congressional representative who had a strong record on civil rights. He might be able to expedite a hearing or at least ensure the Department of Transportation takes our complaint seriously, she suggested. Vanessa nodded. Let's do it. The airline is already feeling the heat from public opinion. If Congress steps in, they'll have no choice but to address this. The meeting ended on a note of cautious optimism. They had direction, they had a legal framework, and they had the beginnings of a coalition. Yet an undercurrent of urgency ran through the group, as though everyone sensed the volatility of the situation. With each passing day, they delved deeper into a labyrinth of potential lawsuits, regulatory reviews, and corporate pushback. That evening, Vanessa returned to her apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a diverse Atlanta neighborhood. She kicked off her heels, eased onto her sofa, and turned on the television to decompress. But the first news segment she flipped to featured a panel discussing her case. She watched as pundits argued back and forth, some praising her for exposing a crucial issue, others dismissing her claims as overblown or playing the race card. The banter made her stomach tighten. Nevertheless, she took pride in the knowledge that real stories of real people were finally coming to light. The momentum was undeniable. If she ever doubted her path, those doubts were drowned out by the voices of those who reached out, thanking her for being brave enough to speak up. She felt the burden of responsibility heavy on her shoulders, but also a renewed sense of clarity. If this was the role she had to play, she would play it fearlessly. In a quiet moment later that night, she gazed at an old photo on her nightstand, her grandmother and mother, arms linked, faces lit with joyous smiles. Both had faced their share of discrimination, fighting for the basic dignity so many took for granted. And now it was Vanessa's turn. Momentum for Vanessa's cause continued to escalate, but Delta Airlines was not about to let her narrative go unchallenged. One crisp Friday morning, the national airwaves lit up with a new development. Delta had launched an internal review committee to examine allegations of racial profiling in its security processes. Initially, that sounded like a positive step, but Vanessa and her legal team soon discovered the committee was stacked with executives and consultants who had deep ties to the airline. None of them had civil rights credentials, and they only vaguely referenced improving passenger experience. Predictably, their interim report published hastily asserted that Delta did not condone discrimination, but there was no clear evidence of system-wide profiling. The airline's PR machine kicked into high gear. They circulated press releases, posted social media ads featuring diverse employees, praising the company's inclusivity, and it even sponsored a high-profile charity event in Atlanta focused on unity and togetherness. The move was transparent to those paying attention. They were trying to reshape the conversation, to drown out Vanessa's growing coalition with a flood of glossy messaging. But the real dagger came when an anonymous source leaked documents to a local newspaper. The document suggested that Delta's corporate leadership had privately expressed worry about excess scrutiny on certain demographic segments. The phrase jolted the public discourse. It confirmed that behind closed doors, executives were aware of potentially discriminatory outcomes. The leak ignited debates across TV news networks, talk radio, and social media. At the same time, Vanessa started receiving unsettling messages on her social platforms, some supportive, but others threatening or abusive. The airline, it seemed, was not alone in wanting to silence her. There were individuals or groups out there who bristled at any suggestion of systemic racism. The vitriol was unnerving. She tried to shield herself, but each beep of a notification caused a spike in her anxiety. Concerned for her safety, Veronica, her friend in D.C., urged her to contact law enforcement about the most serious threats. Vanessa reluctantly agreed, filing a report for the record. She hated feeling vulnerable, but she also knew the price of activism often came with personal risks. Meanwhile, the preliminary steps of the lawsuit moved forward. Victoria and James filed a formal complaint in federal court, naming Delta Airlines and relevant TSA officials. The complaint painstakingly outlined each plaintiff's experience, weaving a narrative that illustrated a pattern of racial profiling and negligence. They sought injunctive relief to force changes in security protocols, along with monetary damages for the affected passengers. The legal action generated front-page headlines. Speculation grew that Ed Bastian, Delta's CEO, might be compelled to speak publicly or even face deposition. The airline's board scrambled to craft a strategy. Should they offer a more substantial settlement or take a defensive posture, vigorously denying wrongdoing? A public statement from Ed Bastian soon followed. Standing behind a podium in a staged press conference, he wore a grave expression as he declared, "At Delta, we believe in fairness, respect, and inclusion for all. We vehemently deny any allegations of systemic discrimination. However, we are willing to work with authorities to clear up any misunderstandings." His calm tone belied the tension swirling behind the scenes. Vanessa watched the press conference from the law office conference room with her attorneys. The words, "any misunderstandings," rattled her. This wasn't a misunderstanding, she thought fiercely. It was oppression, subtle but insidious, wearing the cloak of security protocols. She clenched her fists under the table. They're still trying to spin it. Still trying to cast it as if I'm misinterpreting what happened. James put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. That's why we push forward with the facts. No PR campaign can bury actual evidence. But the PR campaign did create confusion, especially among the general public. Some neutral observers began to question whether this was just a legal money grab. Others argued that while screening mistakes happen, calling it systemic discrimination might be too strong. The swirl of misinformation took a toll on Vanessa's morale. She couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of having become a pawn in a larger game, except in her case, she had chosen to step forward to challenge an entire corporate giant. Late that night, after returning home to her apartment, she sat in darkness, gazing out at the city lights. The hum of traffic lulled in the distance, and for a moment she felt like a solitary figure waging battle against a colossal machine. Doubts flickered in her mind, but she brushed them aside, recalling every traumatized voice that had echoed her own experience. She whispered to herself, "No turning back now," and convinced herself it was the only path. About a month into the legal showdown, Vanessa's phone buzzed with a call from Veronica that would upend everything once again. "They want to schedule a hearing," her friend's voice said, taut with excitement. "The House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is looking into allegations of racial profiling in air travel. They want you to testify." Vanessa's breath caught. "Testify? In Congress?" "Yes. They're planning a special session next month," Veronica confirmed. "They want to hear from you, civil rights experts and industry representatives. Rumor has it Ed Bastian might be subpoenaed, too." Vanessa sank onto her sofa, a wave of both exhilaration and trepidation hitting her. Testifying before Congress was monumental. It was also nerve-wracking. She had never been in front of such a high-profile platform. Plus, going toe-to-toe with corporate lawyers and possibly the CEO himself. This was a far cry from the quiet life she'd once planned. Still, she recognized the magnitude of the moment. A congressional hearing was a rare chance for systemic change, to influence the law at a national level. If the committee found credible evidence of discrimination, it could force the TSA to revise its partnership agreements with airlines or even lead to new legislation that explicitly prohibited race-based profiling in airport screenings. Vanessa quickly contacted Victoria and James. The legal team buzzed with urgent energy. "We need to prepare your testimony carefully," Victoria said. "You'll have to provide a concise, bulletproof account of your experience, plus data that shows this is bigger than one incident." Before long, a swirl of activity consumed Vanessa's days. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with congressional staffers who walked her through the hearing format. She also gathered with civil rights leaders, forging alliances that would lend credibility to her statements. Through it all, her nerves remained on edge. As confident as she was in her story, a part of her dreaded the public spectacle, the personal scrutiny that came with it. When the hearing date finally arrived, she found herself seated at a long wooden witness table, an ornate backdrop of American flags and historical portraits behind the committee members. The room hummed with tension. In the audience, reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. Onlookers craned their necks to see the woman at the center of the maelstrom. On her left sat Victoria, ready to offer legal counsel if needed. On her right sat a representative from the American Civil Liberties Union. Across the aisle, behind another table, were officials from the TSA. And then, at a separate table, Ed Bastian and a cadre of Delta executives, all wearing resolute expressions. Chairwoman Ramirez, a formidable figure renowned for championing consumer rights, banged her gavel. "Let's come to order," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. After the formalities, she gestured to Vanessa. "Miss Carter, you may begin." Vanessa's heart pounded in her ears as she leaned into the microphone. She had rehearsed this, but the sheer gravity of the setting made her mouth go dry. She took a calming breath and launched into her prepared statement. She spoke of her personal ordeal, her background as a community lawyer, and the disturbing pattern revealed by hundreds of similar stories. She presented data compiled by her legal team, citing statistics of increased random screenings for passengers of color. She insisted that her goal wasn't monetary gain, but systemic reform. Her opening remarks lasted barely 10 minutes, yet it felt like an eternity. Then the questions began. Some came from supportive committee members who echoed her concerns. Others were more skeptical, prodding her for specifics or challenging whether she had proof that race, not random chance, was the reason for her screening. Vanessa held her ground, calmly referencing the leaked Delta documents and the anomalies in TSA screening data. She admitted there was no single piece of evidence that spelled out a racist directive, but the cumulative weight suggested a pattern of bias. In the background, Ed Bastian scribbled notes, occasionally whispering to a lawyer at his side. Eventually, it was the CEO's turn to speak. He cleared his throat, adopting a contrite expression. "First, I'd like to apologize to Miss Carter for any inconvenience she experienced," he began. "Delta is committed to ensuring all passengers feel safe and respected. We are investigating any allegations of bias, but we maintain that our company policy and indeed our core values do not condone racial profiling." Vanessa watched him, feeling a pang of anger mixed with a perverse admiration at his polished performance. He was charismatic, acknowledging her complaint without ever fully accepting responsibility for the airline's potential wrongdoing. The hearing stretched for hours. TSA officials dodged pointed questions about their procedures. Bastian offered carefully worded reassurances. However, Vanessa and her advocates managed to present evidence compelling enough to rattle the room. By the end, Chairwoman Ramirez stated that the committee would consider further actions, including potential legislation or regulatory changes. As gavel strikes signaled the hearings close, Vanessa felt a rush of relief and exhaustion. She had stood her ground in one of the most intimidating arenas in the country. Now, all she could do was wait for the political machinery to grind forward. The fight wasn't over, far from it, but she'd taken it to the highest possible stage. Walking out of the hearing room, the corridor erupted with reporters shouting questions. Cameras flashed again, capturing her every step. She felt dazed, but also proud. For better or worse, the entire nation now knew her story, and the airline's CEO had finally been forced to address it publicly under oath. Maybe, just maybe, real change was on the horizon. The congressional hearing was only the beginning of Delta's real troubles. Within days, more passengers came forward, galvanized by Vanessa's powerful testimony. Not only African-American travelers, but also Muslim Americans, Latino families, and travelers with disabilities started sharing stories of targeted screenings. The press coined a name for the phenomenon: security theater profiling. As the public outrage grew, investors started to worry. Delta's stock price took a noticeable dip. Corporate partners questioned whether the airline could stay out of further scandal. Meanwhile, the TSA faced its own wave of criticism, prompting an internal audit that threatened to unearth damning details about how screening decisions were made. In an unexpected move, the Department of Transportation announced a formal inquiry into Delta's compliance with federal anti-discrimination rules. The investigation would be comprehensive, and if the findings confirmed systematic violations, Delta risked substantial fines or sanctions. The airline's board called an emergency meeting, and rumors floated that Ed Bastian's leadership was under threat. Vanessa, staying informed through her legal team and media reports, observed these developments with a blend of vindication and apprehension. She never wanted people to lose their jobs. Her goal had been to secure justice and reforms. Yet the mounting pressure suggested that Delta was now cornered. Hard karma, as some might call it, was coming home to roost for the airline. Then came a dramatic twist. One of Delta's high-ranking executives, a vice president who oversaw customer relations, resigned abruptly. She leaked internal emails that hinted at deeper knowledge within the airline's upper echelons of racially skewed security flagging. In one email chain, a regional manager complained about how staff were over-scrutinizing certain demographics to avoid missing potential threats. The resigned executive wrote in her resignation letter that she couldn't continue in good conscience, knowing the company was willfully ignoring discriminatory practices. The media pounced on the leak, devoting entire primetime segments to dissecting the email chain. Calls for Ed Bastian's resignation grew louder. Politicians cited the leaked emails as proof that legislative action was necessary. Civil rights groups planned a large-scale march at Atlanta's airport to protest discriminatory screenings, drawing further attention to Vanessa's lawsuit. All the while, Vanessa continued her day-to-day life, albeit under immense scrutiny. When she visited her neighborhood grocery store, strangers approached to thank her. Others, spurred by misinformation, hurled nasty comments. It was a surreal existence, being both lauded and vilified in public spaces. Nevertheless, she pressed on, meeting frequently with her legal team to refine strategies. Settlement offers began trickling in again from Delta's lawyers. This time, the sums were astronomical. Delta seemed desperate to quiet the storm by compensating Vanessa and other plaintiffs if only they'd sign non-disclosure agreements and drop the suit. James Marshall reviewed the offers, shaking his head. They think money can make this go away. It won't. Vanessa, it's your call, but my recommendation is to hold the line for real policy changes, not just a payout. Vanessa felt a lump in her throat. She thought of all the people whose voices she'd pledged to represent. We hold out for policy changes. Non-negotiable. Victoria nodded, unwavering. We'll communicate that clearly. If they want to settle, they must adopt enforceable guidelines, new training programs, and a formal admission of wrongdoing. The team's ultimatum left the airline with a stark choice: revamp its entire approach to security or face a drawn-out lawsuit that could cost them dearly in reputation and resources. Corporate negotiations began behind the scenes, while the public battle continued to rage. In a final blow, the Department of Transportation released preliminary findings from their inquiry, evidence that Delta had disproportionately flagged passengers of color for additional screening. The agency recommended formal enforcement action, a step that historically preceded large fines or sanctions. Vanessa read the findings one late night, tears pricking her eyes. She wasn't celebrating others' downfall, but it was the validation she'd needed for so long. Hard karma, indeed, had come for those who perpetuated or ignored discrimination. A once invincible airline giant now found itself exposed, humbled, and threatened with serious repercussions. Under mounting pressure from Congress, regulators, and a thoroughly outraged public, Delta's legal team reached out with a new proposal, an unprecedented settlement that would not only provide compensation for the plaintiffs, but also mandate sweeping changes in security practices. The terms included 1. Public admission of wrongdoing. Delta would issue a formal apology and acknowledge that their screening procedures had disproportionately impacted passengers of color. 2. Independent oversight. An external civil rights auditing firm would monitor Delta's security procedures for 3 years, ensuring compliance with anti-discrimination standards. 3. Policy revisions and training. Delta agreed to comprehensive retraining for staff and an overhaul of how extra screening was determined, including checks on bias indicators. 4. Substantial compensation. Each named plaintiff would receive financial damages. In addition, a fund would be established for other affected travelers to file claims. 5. No gag rule. Unlike prior offers, there would be no non-disclosure agreement forbidding plaintiffs from discussing the settlement. The entire agreement would be public. Late one evening, Vanessa, Victoria, James, and Josephine gathered around the same conference table where they'd started this journey. A hush fell over the room as they read the final draft of the settlement. Emotions ran high relief, triumph, and a touch of disbelief. James leaned back, exhaling. This is historic. I've never seen such a sweeping settlement addressing racial profiling in air travel. Victoria nodded, dabbing her eyes. It's everything we fought for. And the best part is, they can't hide it behind secrecy. They turned to Vanessa, who was silent, her gaze fixed on the pages. She thought of her own humiliating experience, the countless stories from strangers, the tension of testifying before Congress, and the personal attacks she'd endured. A swirl of gratitude and sorrow welled up in her. She recognized that victory had come with a price, yet the potential impact on future travelers was immense. She cleared her throat. "We accept." The next day, the settlement was formally signed and announced publicly. Headlines splashed across national news. Delta admits fault in racial profiling scandal. Historic settlement could reshape airline security. Vanessa Carter's triumph for civil rights in the skies. Social media exploded with congratulatory messages, while skeptics still picked apart the deal, but the legal agreement stood as a milestone. Ed Bastian, facing intense internal pressure, resigned from his CEO position shortly thereafter, citing the need for new leadership to guide Delta forward. His departure was the final punctuation in a saga that had begun with a single missed flight and ended in a profound corporate reckoning. In the midst of the whirlwind, Vanessa maintained her composure. She understood that no single settlement could rectify an entire system overnight. But she also believed that accountability, once demanded and won, could create ripples of change. Airports nationwide began re-evaluating their own security policies, and the TSA announced revisions to its training programs, spurred on by the intense scrutiny. For Vanessa, life would never be the same. Her name was now synonymous with a public battle that transcended her personal pain, influencing the future of air travel for millions. She pledged to stay involved, monitoring how faithfully Delta and others adhered to the terms of the settlement. Still, she looked forward to returning to her first love, representing underserved communities and fighting for everyday justice on the ground. Yet, she knew this victory had validated something crucial. Sometimes, the smallest personal injury can spark a revolution if only someone is brave enough to stand up and declare, "This isn't right, and I won't stay silent." We've witnessed how one courageous stand against injustice can shake an entire industry to its core, ultimately forcing an airline giant to admit wrongdoing and commit to real change. Vanessa Carter's journey began with the sting of humiliation and grew into a fiery quest for accountability, championed by her legal allies and propelled by ordinary people who shared their own hidden traumas. The staggering legal victory not only secured a groundbreaking settlement, but set the stage for deeper reforms in airline screening across the country. Let her story be a reminder that our voices carry weight, especially when we unite against systemic wrongs. If you found this narrative compelling, consider hitting that like button, sharing it so others can learn from Vanessa's fight, and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on more stories that fuel our collective pursuit of justice. Your engagement makes a difference, so join us in amplifying each other's voices.